Your style is almost it's the uncontrolled part of your process, right? It's the stuff that you're not actively thinking about. It's the thing that your art will always have as hard as you fight against it. You can't overthink that stuff, right? Just let it be, it's fine.
In this episode, I'm talking to Tyler James. He's an artist, illustrator, and teacher, mostly known for his work in video games. In this episode, we're talking about his experience dealing with successes and failures and what that's meant for his career as a whole, what he feels like what it takes to become a professional artist, and his advice for trying to make a living off of it. I really enjoyed this episode. I'm a big fan of Tyler and his art. And also, if you'd like to support me, please consider checking out the links below. All of your guys' support really does help me make more content like this. All this content is sponsored by me. Please like and subscribe. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
Well, just in terms of approach, I think it takes quite a long time for you to figure out what works for you. If I think back to my early years, I seem so lost in retrospect. Like, how was I making anything that looked reasonable? Because my process was so random. And nowadays, it's a bit more formulaic, and I still have different ways that I might approach things. But there's less guesswork. And so I guess maybe something to just state up front is, if you don't feel like you have a really consistent process right now, don't worry. Like, that'll get figured out over time. I don't have a whole huge range of ways that I approach things. I would say maybe 3 or 4 workflows generally. In mixed media these days with things like the aid of 3D, for example, that's something that a lot of people really enjoy doing. But for me, I don't do that a whole lot. It kind of depends. If I'm doing an environmental scene and there's a lot of perspective involved, maybe I'll have some kind of a 3D base. But I like to do a lot of character work. And for character work, there isn't usually any 3D involved there. It's just knowing your anatomy and sorting through the poses. But start simple and then work to details. I mean, you know this, right? Like, that's a core concept of working with art is, start with the broad strokes and then get to the details later. And funny enough, if you do it right, some of the details won't even matter. You can be suggestive about stuff, and that can be more powerful.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've talked to people about this, but a lot of people say that most of the work of being an artist is finding the thing that you're willing to do, because so much of it is, there's always a more efficient way of getting a better painting. There's always a more efficient way of getting a better job or whatever, but it's ultimately about what part of the process do you enjoy, because you're making art. You're doing the thing that is inherently less efficient, less financially viable than something like being a lawyer, to do something that you love more, theoretically. So I think it's like, in the long run, I've heard that it's a better idea to find something that you're more interested in than more efficient, because you're more likely to love doing it. And as a result, over your whole career, you're probably going to be doing a better job at that thing.
Right. Yeah. If you love something, you're definitely going to have a better quality level with it. And I think the interesting thing is that there's different aspects that you can love about art. There's the end result. There's the subject matter. There's the story behind it. But then you can also love the process itself. And I think that that's equally important, right? Like, the steps to get there should also be great. I think some of the folks that I've known over the years who kind of burn out, switch careers or whatever, I think part of it is they struggled with falling in love with the process, right? The process kind of burned them out. They loved what they got at the end, but the route to get there was just brutal for them. And I think that goes back to what I was saying before about it takes time to figure out what your favorite process is. And once you figure that out, once it's flowing well, then going from point A to point B to get that thing done doesn't feel as difficult. And, it's like a well-oiled machine that hopefully, right, that's what you're working towards.
Yeah, well, and again, it's like something like 3D or something might make your process more efficient technically, but it might not be as fun. It might be more like, there might be more headache, or like less drawing and more like figuring out how to, move something in the y-axis,
Yeah. You're shifting emphasis, and you may be, like I said, adding time into the parts of the process that you don't like. So you kind of want to figure that out and constantly assess how you're doing things. Take a step back, and actually, someone might not be in the habit of recording themselves making art, because maybe they don't make tutorials, right? Or whatever. But even if it's not for anyone else, try recording yourself doing a painting and just watch it back, because it's super helpful, right? You can it's the same thing as athletes, right? They record themselves doing their gymnastics or whatever it is, and then they can see, oh, you know what, that foot, I'm not, lifting off right, or my knee isn't bending right or whatever. If you record yourself, you can see those subtle things, and you can say, man, this part of my process is like 30% of the time I'm spending. Why am I doing that? I think on that note, a quick thing I can think about is, one of the ways that I might do a painting is I'll kind of establish all of the shadows. So I kind of sculpt all the forms on something that's like white or gray. And then the next step would be to fill in all the colors, which they'd call like a flats pass, right? And I realized early on watching my recordings that I would spend all this time like, filling in these areas with color and like manually coloring things in. It was just silly. And then so I made a little action in Photoshop or whatever, so I can just paint the outline of it, and then I just click in the middle and it fills it for me. And it sounds so simple. It sounds so inconsequential, but when you're doing that thing, I don't know, 30 times a day, that saves you a lot of time in the long run. And it might make that process more enjoyable, because you might get through the painting quicker, and then you're just producing more finished works. And I think that in and of itself can feel real.
Yeah, well, and the goal is to keep it enjoyable. That's the thing, is to keep doing the thing that you're getting excited about. And I mean, I guess I'm playing the time lapse of you doing that illustration on the side while we're having this conversation. But something that I struggle with personally is the rendering stuff, and I think it's like, for me, the way I get better at that is not necessarily just doing more and more studies, because I've done plenty of those, and for some reason I just can't pick it up. It's to go out and just like find the thing that makes like the whole idea of rendering enjoyable, so I can actually just go and render stuff to find whatever process works best for me.
Yeah, it is really, it's a search for the holy grail. I kind of allude to that a lot in my own educational materials, is that you're always searching for the perfect process, right? You never find the perfect one, but it's nice to think that it's out there. And the closer you get, I think the more satisfying everything feels. And rendering is a big topic. It's the thing that I think a lot of people find challenging. And if you're somebody who you have a lot of great time in the saddle doing figure drawings, right? I'm sure people know you on your YouTube for all the great figure drawing content you have. And there are some things doing digital rendering that you may not pick or drawing, right? I think you'll get all these great core concepts, but then there might be some of these weird digital techniques that are off your radar. And so, hopefully sharing some of the time lapse on the video today, people can kind of see just one of the ways that I might approach this, where you've got a decent drawing laid out, and then you go in and you sort of establish all of the form sculpting as its own pass. And I think that might be the best way to explain the approach that you're seeing, is that there's a series of passes, which is different than what some might call alla prima, right? Where you're sort of just trying to lay the perfect thing down right out of the gate and just create like a masterpiece, right? Like, I think that process works really well when you have something in front of you that you can paint directly, right? It's like, okay, there's no design going on. There's no guesswork. It's like, I'm looking at what I need to create. Now let's just translate that. And I think that for me, alla prima is a lot more possible when I have that perfect reference in front of me. But as soon as it's more organic than that, as soon as I want to sort of play around with the design and tinker with things, that's when I really like doing a render more in separate passes.
Yeah. Well, and understanding the theory doesn't help. I mean, it does help technically, but like you can pretty easily explain how to shade a sphere in like 5 or 10 minutes, but then applying that to like an orc, and then applying that to a pretty lady, to armor, to all those different things, you're using the same fundamental concept. It's just applied to more complicated subject matter. And I think there's something to be said about just pure mileage on your medium. Like, I feel really confident on like smooth newsprint and Conte pencil, or like one specific brush in Photoshop doing gesture drawings. But then anything else beyond that, I just I feel like I lose the ability to draw,
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of becoming great at something, though, is you get really particular about every aspect of it. I mean, I'm thinking back to I was watching a video about, I think it was who's the guy on YouTube who does all of the music reviews?
Antonio something or whatever, the bald guy.
No, it's not. It's a different guy. Gosh, I wish I could remember. Anyway, he interviews this this guy Yngwie Malmsteen, who is this like amazing, legendary metal guitarist who is heavily inspired by like classical music. So his riffs are like all of these complex arpeggios and all this stuff, and it was a cool video. And in the interview, he talks about how, you know, like the pick and the way you hold it and the speakers you use. And I mean, and every great guitarist is going to be this way, right? Like the pedals got to be this certain way, and the everything, you get so particular about it. And I think with art, it's the same thing, right? You're like, there's that brush that I love, or there's that, you know, Conte 1710B that I love to use on newsprint, and it's got to be this certain newsprint. And I think that that's kind of cool, right? Like, I don't shy away from being particular about my tools.
Yeah, well, and I think the other thing there is like, you know, being great at something means that you have to sacrifice being good at something else, you know, because something like alla prima painting, and if you're insanely good at that, it might hurt your design skills, you know, or if you're great at drawing from imagination, maybe drawing from life is more difficult, you know. And I think that a big part of all this stuff is leaning into the stuff that you are good at, and then being okay being bad at the things you're bad at, and kind of accepting it, you know?
Yeah. And that's super hard for people who are newer to their field as well, because there's a lot of fear that you're not going to have skills that are employable, or that you're not going to get noticed. And so it's a difficult thing to say, I'm not going to be good at this stuff. Like, for example, I wouldn't want anyone to hire me to design vehicles. I'm just going to be straight up honest. I don't enjoy designing vehicles. I probably suck at it. I wouldn't know because I never do it. And it just helps me to know that I can be a little bit more focused. And if you spread yourself too thin, this is just common knowledge, right? You spread yourself too thin, then you're really not super good at anything, which, yeah, I mean, I guess there's career routes for that too, but it's not something that I would find as satisfying.
Yeah, and again, I think the goal of this stuff is not efficiency and in money. It's to enjoy it as much as you possibly can.
Yeah. And again, it's like what you mentioned with that cycle. If you enjoy it, then you're probably going to get decent at it. And then if you're decent at it, then people will find you, right, to work with you and create stuff.
Well, and I think at least the arc for me, I think is pretty similar to where I got into art and drawing and painting and fine art, because I really love like Wei Wang. I love like World of Warcraft concept art. And that was the thing that got me excited about all that stuff. Like Trenkanuga's old stuff on Burning Crusade and all that is like, it's so awesome.
Yeah, I love Trent stuff and yeah, Wei as well. Just, yeah, great inspirations.
And just going down the list of all those guys, they're all so cool. But then getting into it and like realizing and navigating the path of like, oh, I should do figure drawing, and then realizing there are parts of figure drawing that I enjoy more than doing that kind of stuff. You know, it's like different art forms. And then eventually landing on like John Singer Sargent and all those artists is like, those are the artists that I love now, you know. But it starts out with something that's, you know, like aspirational and kind of like, I don't want to say immature or anything, but it's just like that. That's like your first interest is something that's just like whatever gets you excited at first. And then you find the other things as a result of just going down the path. And you have no idea what's going to, like what you can't predict what you're going to like the further that you go, the further that you go down it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me that one of the things that I will have my students do early in the class is an influence map, which is just a sheet where you sort of add images of things that inspire you or artists that you think inspire you. And, you know, it's partially for me as an instructor to kind of get a sense for the student, but also it's for the student to know about themselves, because newer artists, I find it's interesting that a lot of times they don't really know. Either they don't know what they like, or they don't know why they like what they like, right? So we can sort of look at a map, an influence map, and we can see, okay, well, there's this like style happening with all of them. They all have outlines or whatever. And if I see that, then maybe I can say like, well, hey, do you know about Alphonse Mucha? Maybe you should check his stuff out because that's who these artists are looking at, right? And you can trace those breadcrumbs back in time. That's always a fun process to go through with newer artists, is that sort of influence map thing.
Absolutely. One, I think it's interesting to see, like, you know, like if you put two teachers or two students or whatever, two people next to each other drawing the same exact subject matter at the same time with the same materials, they're going to have two completely different drawings stylistically, probably, at least, you know. And that has nothing to do with the fundamentals. That has everything to do with who you are internally and what your preferences are. And
yeah,
the preferences are like look at that deltoid. Should the like lateral head be darker or lighter than this side? And your preference over time either becomes like something that's World of Warcraft-esque or something that's like John Singer Sargent-esque, you know?
Yeah. And the key there is, you know, you can do whatever you want as long as you're consistent in your approach in the image, right? Like you can sort of, it's the idea of stylization. You can define your world however you'd like, but the consistency is what allows your audience to buy into that stylization. Yeah.
Well, Nate, so much of it is just intuitive. You know, it's like not being judgmental of the decisions you're making as you're making them. Because I think it's like, especially when you're drawing representationally, or I know everyone compares themselves to other people, but when you're constantly thinking like, oh man, I wish this was looking different, or you're critiquing every single part of your own process as you're doing it, I think it's impossible to be creative. It's impossible to do art.
Yeah, you can definitely get a little bit paralyzed by overanalyzing things.
Well, it's cool looking at your process for all this stuff, because it seems like a lot of it is just intuitive. Like, I'm sure you're looking at reference, but so much of it seems like you've done it a billion times and you're just kind of letting it come out of you, because you're so in tune with the process and the tools that you're using.
I've really fought to get to that point, and it's taken so long, and obviously my journey never ends, right? Like, we're always learning, but you know, it is something that I've put a lot of time into trying to get to, is the moment where I do feel like there's less interference between my brain and the page. You know, you want to try to strengthen that signal as much as you can, make that path very clear, and so you don't want it to be filled with a lot of questions. But I just wanted to speak for a moment about reference materials. You know, I think there's something that I also kind of speak to my students about in terms of design strategy, inventing things, and a common pitfall I see is gathering and looking at too much reference at the same time. A lot of times you'll see people say, yeah, get reference, look at reference, and that's true. But also, you don't want to have a giant influence or a giant mood board in front of you that's got 20 images, and then there's you on your, board trying to draw something from it. How are you really going to use anything useful out of that many images at once? So my suggestion with reference is to just, maybe you start that way, right? Maybe you start with a big giant mood board, but when you go to actually create a design, create an iteration, create a thumbnail, whatever it is, limit it. Think about, what are the fewest amount of inputs I need to make something unique? It could even just be one, right? Maybe you're just looking at one reference, and then as you look at it, you're making small changes to every part of it, and then it sort of just gets molded into your own thing. That could be fine. My favorite way is to do the mashup, which is just pick two things and see what happens when you smash them together. And that's really fun, right? Like, it kind of almost reminds you of a kid mentality of like, yeah, what happens if it's like, Deadpool versus, Mystique, or, whatever, right? It's this fun, like, kind of versus mashup, right? And it's like, okay, what happens if we do this mad scientist thing where we just smash these two ideas together? And it makes it fun. Like you said before, right? If you can find something that's fun, then hopefully that'll show in the final result.
Well, and again, I think it's like, it's all about simplicity. And I think it's all about like doing actionable things. It's like, I had a Richard Taylor on my interview show. Finally, they'll be validated, or finally they will feel good enough.
No, you'll never be validated. In many ways, that's a bit of a negative thing to say, because you should never settle to be validated, right? It's irrelevant what others think.
Talking to him about Lord of the Rings and stuff was really interesting, because like, how do you make like a 3-movie, 10-hour long trilogy? And it's like, at some point you have to worry about like the chainmail, you know, you have to worry about linking individual pieces of chainmail together to create, you know, 10,000 chainmail vests to wear so extras can wear them and it looks good on camera and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of tedious hole digging that goes along with that, but it's actionable and it's doable, you know?
Absolutely.
And they probably could spend like, you could justifiably spend 10 years doing that single task, figuring out what exact proper metal to use, making it historically accurate to a T, you know, making sure everything is just right before even starting it. And I think that applies to like doing a comic book or doing a video game or doing an illustration. When you look at a giant project, from the surface, it looks incredibly complicated and that you'd never be able to start it, but everything is built brick by brick. And the act of finding a style does seem like that, you know, like the combining one thing at a time, and then eventually it turns into a much larger thing eventually.
Yeah. And the good thing too is that, you know, you don't even necessarily have to actively think too hard about your style. Like your style is almost it's the uncontrolled part of your process, right? It's the stuff that you're not actively thinking about. It's the thing that your art will always have, as hard as you fight against it. That's like, for me, it's always weird when people will tell me, I can tell that that's yours. I can tell it's your piece. It sounds weird. It sounds scary. Like, oh my gosh, am I that detectable? But you can't overthink that stuff, right? Just let it be, you know, it's fine. And don't obsess too much about it. I mean, unless there's some very weird, unique look that you're trying to develop for some very specific project, okay, then maybe that requires more active thought. But in terms of just your own kind of organic developments, I would say don't overthink it.
Yeah, well, and like inevitably you can't help but have like a voice and an identity, you know, and like the famous one that people talk about is like Rob Liefeld's feet drawings and his Captain America drawing, you know, and it's like, you know, people can shit on him till the end of time for those mistakes, but has more money than both of us.
Yeah, but in the process, he became legendary, right? Like, and honestly, too, like I would say, negative publicity isn't always bad. I mean, depending on what it is, but you know, maybe you do have a piece where it's, you know, a meme or whatever, and as long as it doesn't fully, I think, crush you or fully invalidate everything else you've done. I mean, yeah, some of those things can actually be kind of fun to reflect on. Like, man, yeah, remember that time when I drew that and it didn't look very good?
Or when
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, go for it.
Well, or when Luke kissed Leia too. It's like, what the fuck? It's crazy. Yeah, it's insane. You know.
Yep, exactly. But in the moment, though, obviously, it's super hard to put that in perspective. You feel, I mean, art is all about putting yourself out there, right? You're vulnerable when you share your work.
Yeah.
And, you know, just when you publish something, you're always nervous that you didn't catch something, right? I remember when I was doing client work, freelance stuff very early on, before I'd send anything off, I would count the fingers on the hands. Like I would do these, even though it was like I wouldn't mess that up, I would just go through this list of like, okay, let's just check all this stuff because boy, would that be embarrassing if I did something wrong there, right? And it sounds like, how would you ever mess that up? But it can happen. And I just, you don't want to like miss something as easy as that. So it's okay to, I think, have like a checklist of things to just make sure before you publish something, especially if you're going to finish something and then send it immediately, right? If you can't sit on it for a night and relook at it, then you want to have a little bit of a checklist to make sure. Like flip your images too. Hopefully everybody watching knows to do that, right? Flip your images horizontally so you can see if there are any weird symmetry issues.
Yeah. Well, and it comes to an interesting point where it's like you're doing this art for yourself to love the process as much as you can, but then at a certain point you have to start doing it for other people if you're doing it professionally, because you have to start making money to pay rent and survive, you know?
Yeah.
So you have to start relying on other people's definitions for what good and bad art is, because you have to get their approval to get paid to keep this stuff sustainable. And at certain points, you're going to be chosen and you're not going to be chosen, you know, and you kind of have to like figure out how to deal with that emotionally, you know?
Well, it's really important to remember that when you are not chosen for a position, it doesn't necessarily say anything about your skill level, right? It oftentimes comes down to just a stylistic mismatch. You know, it's like there are so many, especially these really, really big studios. Obviously, there's lots of people that want to work at these places on these big projects. They have access to a lot of artists. So, you know, they're going to pick the person who is plug and play. It's like they've got two artists, they're both masters, but this person maybe uses more of a like subdued, less reflective quality on their materials, and that's the look we're going for. So we're going to pick them, right? It could just something as subtle as that, and then hopefully this other person over here who has great work, but maybe goes for a little more of a shiny look to their stuff, isn't feeling like they suck afterward, right? I mean, that is, I think, easier to stomach those sorts of things when you're an established veteran, and as a new artist, that can feel like you just suck, right? Like there's just no way you're going to ever get a job or whatever. And that's, again, since I work with students and stuff, I have to really remind them of that.
Yeah, well, I think it's like the best advice I've ever gotten is to tie 0% of your self-worth to the way your art is received, you know, or received. And it's like,
yeah.
That it's not like how, like, what's the best pencil or what's the best program to draw on. It's always like, just don't worry about what other people think, because
Sure.
You might put your heart and soul into something and it might be well received or not, but you almost have no control over whether it's going to be well received at all.
You don't. I have a kind of like a funny example I use of, you know, like maybe there's the recruiter who's opening up your application that day, and maybe, you know, they got like the stomach flu that day or something, right? And so they're just feeling all crappy and they're at their desk, and then maybe they got to like run to the bathroom while they're looking at your portfolio. That might be the reason you don't get picked, right? Like it could be something completely crazy and absurd like that, but unfortunately that stuff can happen. And that's further reason why you don't want to tie your entire emotional stability to acceptance for a position. Like you just don't know the variables at play. There's been situations where I've done art tests for studios, and the official communication with that studio was, you know, straightforward. Like, okay, we got this art test. You're going to do these things. Hopefully you get the job. Good luck. But I have like a friend working at the studio who would know that I was doing the test. And halfway through the test, he would tell me, hey, they already hired somebody else for that spot you're doing the art test for. And like, that's mind blowing, right? And so I would just stop doing the art test. What the heck is the point of this, right? And basically the point of that story is to say that there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and communication isn't always the best. And I'm sure people watching who have applied for positions and gotten rejection letters know that there's never any extra communication typically. So just disconnect from it, right? Move on, move to the next best thing, keep pushing yourself.
Yeah, and it's always just about trying your best. Like everyone has that story where they were, you know, they didn't have any credentials or they didn't have any credibility at anything, and then like over time they just built it. Like a 20-year career or something happened in between that. Now there's some crazy, you know, influential art director or movie director or something, but it took years and years of failure and just hitting their head against a wall.
You never see the failures, right? You only see the successes. And that's, again, you got to kind of make sure that you're assessing the lay of the land in a logical way, which is tough. It's tough.
Well, and like even from like a more practical perspective, like if we look at someone like a band like the Beatles, you know, it's like the most famous band of all time. I could name a lot of their songs, but I couldn't name most of their songs, you know?
Sure.
And it's like off the top of my head right now, I could name like 5 without thinking about it. And it's like, but then after that, it's like, I don't really like, you know, Strawberry Fields, Let It Be, you know, or Hey Jude. But it's like after that, it gets kind of like, I don't know.
Yeah. Penny Lane, Paperback Writers. Yeah. But I mean, it's like, there's like whatever their top 20. And then, you know, beyond that, it gets quite fuzzy unless you're a fan. Right. And then, you know, everything about it.
But then it's like, then there's the songs they didn't release and stuff. And, you know, we look at like even studio game projects or studio projects. There's so many ideas behind the scenes that in the idea phase of like starting a new game at Riot or Blizzard or wherever, there might be 1,000 games that are pitched that all have basis in reality and they're all good ideas, and then one is picked, and then that game has 5 years development, and then it's canceled.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can even just be on a game for years that never comes out, which that I've done that too, and that's an interesting process. But there's a lot of stuff that just gets left on the cutting room floor, and it doesn't see the light of day. It can be awkward sometimes because artists might have a lot of work put into a project that doesn't come out, and then their work is locked under NDA, right? Like, it's like, well, this is the work I'm supposed to use to try to get a job, and yet I can't show anybody, right? It creates this really interesting dilemma. But yeah, that could be its own whole entire conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I guess it's just more to highlight that so many things are out of your control when you're doing this stuff that it's important to just keep on doing the work. Every time that I focused on the outcome and I've been focused on like getting more subscribers or trying to, impress a certain person, I've made worse work. So then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've gotten less prospects as a result of that. And I think it's like, whenever I talk to people that do get these positions, just because they're really hyper-focused on just doing the work as much as possible.
Yeah, I think too, just in terms of staying motivated and growing, social media can be helpful in that way. It's I think the healthier way to use social media, particularly things like posting to Instagram, where you're not posting for the reaction, you're posting as a journal of your progress. It's for you, right? And I think if you think of it that way, it's a lot healthier an interaction, and it can motivate you to do something. I'll go to my Instagram and be like, man, I haven't posted in a while. I should probably do something new. Like, let's put something else up there, and that'll motivate me, right? And I think that's a useful way to do that. And if you just get into those habits, a year will go by and you'll look back and you'll be like, man, actually, I think I'm better now. Like, and that's maybe another thing to say is growth is slow and steady. And if you don't reflect far enough back, the growth may not be super obvious to you. So I would recommend that people look at their work a year ago or more to really see where you've gone, where you've taken things.
Yeah. And I think it's always just being okay with who you are today, So much of this stuff is like just good mental health practices. Like, don't worry about it. Like, the jobs aren't going anywhere. People are going to be wanting to try to make money off you for your whole existence. It's like,
yeah.
And again, there's always those stories of someone becoming successful at 50 or becoming successful in their late 20s or 30s or 40, whatever, and I think especially among art students, there is that pressure where you hear these outlier stories to where somebody got hired at Lucasfilm at 21 or something, right out of high school, and they're working on the next big Star Wars projects or something. But that's few and far between, and I don't think it's necessarily as like idyllic of a story as what it might seem on the surface, at least.
Yeah, that's an unfair story to compare yourself against. That's an outlier. Again, look at the averages and kind of assess yourself in a more logical way, in a more fair way. That's great. Yeah, that's great. I mean, good job, whoever that was, right? That's fantastic. But that's really, really unusual for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think getting a job at those sorts of like dream studios that everyone talks about is that like slow, and like generally people will work at 5 or 6 to 10 different companies before even having a shot at doing those sorts of things. Oh yeah, absolutely. It could take many, many tries to get it right, and also just to have the right timing. Like, again, your stuff at that moment is the right look. You're in the right kind of zone in your artistic career to match with their project that's going through its own cycle. I mean, you just have to kind of hope that all those kind of lines cross at the right moment. Again, and why you don't want to focus on those rejections, because it's got to sync up. That doesn't happen that often. For sure. Well, and I think also there is no like end point at which you are completely validated as well either. Like, I meet people all the time who work at, again, those dream studios who are like itching to get out. They're like, I want to do something else creatively.
Yeah.
And again, it's like having the dream job doesn't mean that you're, on cloud nine for the rest of your life. You might feel great about it for a week or two or a month or something, but then eventually it's still a job, and you still have to put in the hours and the work and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's super important, regardless of wherever you're employed, to have your own personal projects going. Like that's a sanity thing, right? Like you need to kind of feel like you have a sandbox that has no rules, or rules that you fully define. So that's another suggestion just for everybody, regardless of where you work or whatever. Just have your own thing going, whether it's a solo thing or with a few other friends, whatever it is. That's just a good creative outlet for you.
Is there anything else specific you want to talk about, or like in relation to this YouTube video?
I'll peruse the comments on the video to see if people have questions about any of the stuff that they were seeing in the video, right? Some of the process stuff. But yeah, hopefully just kind of seeing it make sense. Again, just if you're trying to get into doing digital art, try to just do it in stages. I think it makes it a lot more approachable.
Yeah, and again, it seems like, again, focus on the process and focus on trying to make it as enjoyable as possible, right?
Yes, definitely enjoyable is important. So if you're doing something a certain way right now and it feels like you're in pain constantly doing it, then just find a different way. There's many ways to do the same thing. So, just kind of go out there, look at videos, watch tutorials, check out courses by artists that you like. All that stuff are ways for you to just add tools to your toolbox. So that way, when you hit something and you're like, I don't really enjoy this process, well, then now there's 3 other things you can go look at and try those instead.
Well, and if someone's actual preference is to be drawing anime boys over doing John Singer Sargent studies, go draw anime boys,
Yeah. If you love doing that, then I bet you'll be making some really sweet anime boys, right? Like you'll probably have the best anime boys ever. And that's great, right? Like be great at whatever it is that you love. Because it's really hard to be good at the stuff that you hate. It's going to show.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, how should people follow you, and can they reach out at all on Instagram or anything like that?
Yeah, totally. Again, thanks, Christian, for the opportunity to chat for a bit. It was super fun. If anybody wants to find me, I'm Art of Ty, basically everywhere. ARTOFTY. Got a website, got Instagram, over at ArtStation. I'm on DeviantArt still, begrudgingly. I know that site has done some weird AI stuff and whatnot, but I've been on there for so long, and I've got so many people that follow what I'm doing on there. I'm just like, yeah, whatever. I'm not gonna just delete my account.